Steam rises from yesterday's grease. Cracked enamel, a chipped spoon, the smell of onions slow-cooked in lard. These were working-class meals. Stretch it till Friday meals, made from bone, bread, and thyme. They didn't come from cookbooks. They came from survival, passed down in whispers, not recipes. This is 25 working man's dinners no one makes anymore. Not forgotten, just waiting to be remembered. Ham hocks and cabbage, the boiler room classic. It always started with a sizzle, not the sharp crackle of bacon in a pan, but a deep, low hum, like boots on linoleum. Ham hocks hitting hot fat, the skin blistered, the air thickened. If your house smelled like this, someone was home, and they were working with what they had. Ham hocks weren't a prize. They were scraps. Too tough to chew raw, too sinewy to pan fry. But slow them down, drown them in water and wait, you'd have something close to magic. In kitchens without granite, with stoves missing knobs, this was soul food-born necessity. A single hock, salted and smoked to near leather, could stretch its flavor across a whole head of cabbage. No need for fancy broth. The pork did the work. As it boiled, the fat loosened, the meat softened, the cabbage, pale green and stubborn, soaked in every drop of flavor. The smell? It filled the house. It crept into school uniforms and dish towels. And no one complained. You didn't need a recipe. Just instinct and time. Some families added a splash of vinegar. Others tossed in a handful of black peppercorns or a spoonful of mustard. But most just used water and willpower. The pot sat on the back burner for hours. You'd lift the lid just to peek. Steam would rise in a slow puff, thick and fragrant. The hock would start to break down, the meat curling back from the bone. That bone, big, heavy, nearly prehistoric, would stick out like a handle. And when the cabbage turned limp and glassy, dinner was ready. It was ladled out with care. A piece of meat for whoever worked hardest. Cabbage for everyone else. Juice soaked into slices of white bread or spooned over boiled potatoes. Not a drop went to waste. There was nothing photogenic about it. No garnish. No plating. Just a hot bowl, a fork, and maybe a splash of hot sauce. It was poverty food, but it was also power food. Thrifty, fatty, filling. Enough to warm your ribs in January. Enough to feed 5 kids and still have some left the next day. And reheated, it was even better. You'd swear the cabbage grew thicker overnight. The broth deepened, smoky and soft, like a flannel blanket in food form. Today, it's a dish that rarely shows up on menus. Too humble, too smelly, too real. But for those who remember, it wasn't just dinner. It was a lesson in patience, a blueprint for surviving lean times with flavor, with pride. And it always started with that quiet, slow sizzle. Braised rabbit with root veg, the forgotten Sunday roast. There's a kind of silence that falls when rabbit hits the pot, a hush of respect, or maybe just memory. It was once the poor man's roast, before chicken became cheap and factory farmed. Rabbits were backyard currency. You didn't buy them. You raised them, fed them scraps, and thanked them quietly when the time came. This wasn't a rabbit from petting zoos or storybooks. This was food. Lean, slightly sweet, and packed with flavor that didn't need much dressing up. It started with a rub, salt, pepper, maybe thyme if you had some left. The meat browned fast in hot fat. It curled at the edges, turned golden, and stuck just enough to build a fond. Then came the root vegetables. Carrots with soft shoulders. Potatoes with eyes you had to carve out. Onions so old they made you cry before you cut them. Everything went into the same pot. No fuss. Water. A splash of vinegar. Maybe a pinch of sugar if the roots were bitter. The lid went on and the wait began. 2 hours later, it smelled like winter breaking. The rabbit went tender first. You could twist a leg, and it would surrender. The potatoes cracked at the edges, their middles soaked with rabbit broth and onion sweetness. Carrots turned to butter. The gravy, if you could call it that, was thin but rich. A little gray, a little greasy, and full of flavor you couldn't fake. On the plate, it looked modest, but in the mouth, it was soft, warming, deeply savory. Meat that melted without being mushy. Vegetables that made you forget you hated vegetables. People often turned up their noses at rabbit. Too bony, too wild, but those who grew up on it knew better. You didn't need a knife, just bread to mop the juices. No one asked for seconds because everyone got plenty the first time. That was the trick. Make a little rabbit stretch like a roast. And afterward, the bones were clean, so, well, they clicked when they hit the plate. There's a reason you don't see this dish anymore. It takes time. It takes care. And it takes an understanding of hunger that most people have forgotten. But for those who remember it, rabbit was never just meat. It was Sunday. It was family. It was everything working-class cooking stood for, making the most of what you had and turning it into something worth remembering. Pickled pig's feet, the jar by the register. They sat there like a dare and a comfort at the same time. Those glass jars by the register, filled to the brim with cloudy, briny vinegar and curved, pale pink pig's feet. Some folks walked right past them, barely looking. Others, they'd drop a wrinkled dollar on the counter and point with 2 fingers. Gimme one. Pickled pig's feet weren't for everyone. But if you knew, you knew. This wasn't the kind of snack you found in glossy cookbooks or served on doilies. This was country store cuisine, gas station gourmet. A holdover from the days when refrigeration was a luxury and pickling was how you survived a long winter or made sure nothing went to waste. And waste nothing they didn't. The feet were split, cleaned, and simmered low and slow until every tendon turned to jelly. Every bone gave way with the gentle push of the thumb. Then they were packed into jars with hot vinegar, a fistful of peppercorns, a wisp of garlic, maybe a chili or 2 if you liked them hot. The acid did its job, preserving, flavoring, transforming. By the time they hit the shelf, the meat had taken on the full tang of the brine, tart, salty, with just a whisper of porky richness hiding underneath the vinegar's sharp edge. Some folks gnawed them straight from the jar, licking their fingers and dabbing at their lips with the corner of a paper napkin. Others brought them home, chilled them, ate them slowly with crackers and hot sauce, the way their daddy or grandpa used to. It was a working-class delicacy, a badge of upbringing, a conversation starter at lunch counters and bait shops. You didn't just eat pickled pig's feet. You had a relationship with them. Maybe it started as a dare from a cousin at a family barbecue. Maybe it was a ritual between you and your old man, 1 foot, 2 bottles of beer, and a whole lot of storytelling. Or maybe it was just what you reached for when you wanted something bold, different, and unapologetically real. Because that's what they were. Real. No smoke. No mirrors. Just a jar of something old, humble, and deeply rooted in survival. These feet told a story of southern backroads and corner stores, of front porches and summer afternoons, of making the most of every part of the animal, because food wasn't something you wasted. Even today, if you can find a good jar, there's something electric about cracking that lid and hearing the hiss of vinegar rise up. You catch a whiff, your eyes sting a little, and it all comes rushing back. The tile floor of the store, the hum of the cooler, the old man behind the counter who always gave you a nod like you were in on something special. And maybe you were, because pickled pig's feet weren't just food. They were a piece of history. A salty, tangy, chewy reminder that the best flavors often come from the humblest places. Chicken livers and rice, velvet on a budget. Chicken livers and rice weren't meant to impress. They were meant to satisfy. And they did that job beautifully, night after night, on stovetops where the pans were well-worn and the cabinets were bare, but for the essentials. This was food you could count on. Cheap, filling, full of flavor if you knew how to coax it out. You start with the livers. $1 or $2 for a tray, rinse under cold water and patted dry. Their deep burgundy sheen like little velvet coins. They had a texture some folks couldn't get past, but those who could, they were rewarded with bites that were rich, creamy, and almost buttery if cooked just right. Into the skillet they went, sizzling in hot fat, bacon grease if you had it, oil or butter if you didn't. A dusting of flour, salt, and maybe a touch of paprika gave them a slight crust. They cooked fast. A few minutes on each side until the outsides were golden and the insides just barely pink. Overcook them and they turned chalky. But treat them right and they melted in your mouth. The smell filled the kitchen quick, meaty, earthy, with that unmistakable iron edge. Some folks added onions, caramelized low and slow until they turned sweet and sticky, a perfect contrast to the liver's depth. Others splashed in a little broth, letting it bubble into a quick gravy, thick enough to spoon over rice. And yes, the rice, fluffy white rice, steamed soft and plain, was a canvas. It soaked up the drippings, the brown bits scraped from the pan, the peppery gravy if you made one. It stretched the meal, gave it heft. Even just a few livers could feed a table when there was rice to go around. Some families added peas, others a dash of hot sauce. A few poured cold milk into a glass and called it dinner. But what made chicken livers and rice special wasn't the ingredients. It was the ritual, the smell that greeted you when you walked through the door, the hiss of the pan, the clink of the spoon against the pot as someone stirred the rice. It was being told, eat slow. There's enough if you're still hungry, and knowing that was true, even when money was tight. This dish was dinner on a Tuesday after the electric bill got paid. It was what you made when the fridge looked empty, but you still had a few staples tucked away. It was comfort food with grit and grace, cheap, yes, but not poor in soul. Even today, if you make it just like Grandma did, the memory comes back strong. Sitting at that vinyl-covered table, swinging your legs beneath the chair, waiting for your plate. The liver smelled strange at first, but once you tasted them, you understood. There was richness there, warmth, familiarity, because chicken livers and rice weren't just a meal. They were a moment, a reminder that even the most modest ingredients, treated with care and cooked with love, could turn into something truly tender. Stuffed bell peppers with ground beef and rice, the fridge cleaner's feast. They looked like little edible trophies. Fat bell peppers, hollowed out and filled to bursting with a hot, meaty secret. Stuffed peppers weren't fancy. They were resourceful. A meal disguised as something celebratory. Start with the pepper. Red if you could afford the sweetness. Green if that's what was on sale. Cut the cap off. Scoop the ribs. Rinse them under cold water until they were smooth little cups. Then the filling. Ground beef, brown till it crumbled like gravel. Leftover rice, usually day-old, cold from the fridge. A chopped onion, some garlic, maybe diced tomato, if you were lucky. Salt, pepper, a shake of dried oregano. Some added ketchup. Others used tomato paste. Both worked. The key was moisture. Enough sauce to keep things tender, not soupy. A scoop of the mix went into each pepper, packed in with a spoon and a gentle push. Tight enough to hold, loose enough to breathe. Then came the bake. In a glass dish, maybe greased, maybe not. A splash of water in the bottom to keep things from drying out. Foil over the top like a blanket. The smell filled the whole house. It was the smell of dinner done right. Earthy, savory, sweet from the caramelizing peppers. Some topped theirs with cheese halfway through, melty cheddar or a slice of processed gold. Others left them plain, the pepper tops browned and bubbling. When you cut into one, steam puffed out. The rice had soaked in juices. The beef clung to every grain. It was spoon food, soft and hearty. You'd get 1 pepper per person. 2 if it was Friday and the week's bills were paid. And the best part? The burnt bits at the bottom of the pan. Sticky, crispy rice and ground meat soaked in sweet pepper runoff. The kind of flavor that made you eat standing at the counter, licking the spoon. This was a dish that made scraps feel special. A way to turn leftovers into celebration. It was colorful, hearty, and warm all the way through. And for the working class, it was a symbol of using what you had, of feeding everyone with care, of finding joy in the ordinary. Oxtail stew with barley, the richest broke man's meal. The oxtail was a puzzle. Knobby, bony, barely meat. But put in a pot and give it time, it turned into something legendary. This dish started slow. Oxtail rinsed, dried, then browned hard in a Dutch oven. The bones hissed on contact. Fat rendered, bits stuck to the bottom like flavor anchors. Then came the aromatics. Onion, celery, carrot, chopped rough, thrown into dance in the drippings. Garlic, bay leaf, maybe a dash of soy sauce if your pantry leaned that way. And the barley, tiny pearls, dry, humble, and quiet. But once they soaked in broth, They became little pillows of texture. Water or stock went in. The whole pot covered, then simmered low. Hours passed. The oxtail softened, marrow loosened, and the broth went cloudy with richness. This wasn't a weeknight meal. This was a Sunday stew. You stirred it every so often. The barley swelled. The meat began to fall away from the bones, stringy and gelatinous, thick with depth. The smell? Deep, almost sweet, like beef but older, earthier, a scent that made you feel hugged from the inside out. When it was ready, it looked like something out of an old country kitchen. Brown, lumpy, steaming. Each spoonful had something. Tender meat, squishy barley, a carrot chunk slick with fat. It stuck to your ribs. It clung to your memory. No one threw out oxtail where money was tight. It was gold wrapped in bone. Even the bones themselves had value. You'd suck them clean, tongue the crevices, get every drop of flavor hidden inside. And afterward, you slept deep, full-bellied, safe. This wasn't just a stew. It was a strategy for making the most of little, for feeding a family with one pot, and for turning a throwaway cut into something close to sacred. Cold meatloaf sandwich, the ultimate second-day win. Cold meatloaf sandwiches weren't just leftovers. They were an upgrade, a quiet little miracle that happened the day after the real meal had long disappeared into full bellies and clean plates. In homes where nothing was wasted and everything was stretched, the cold meatloaf sandwich wasn't just a second-day solution. It was a moment you actually looked forward to. You'd open the fridge the next morning, and there it was, a solid block of yesterday's meatloaf, firmer now, easier to slice. No longer steaming, but somehow more flavorful. The ketchup glaze on top had darkened and tightened, like a lacquered badge of honor. You'd cut it into thick slabs, each one holding together better than when it was fresh out of the oven. Then came the bread. Not artisan, not fancy, just soft white sandwich bread pulled from a bag that had been clipped shut with a bread tab. Maybe it was a day old, maybe two. If you were lucky, someone had heels left, the end pieces, because those held up best. Spread a little mayo on one side, maybe mustard on the other, or just plain if that's how Grandpa liked it. Layer on the cold meatloaf. Some folks added sliced onion. Others, a piece of iceberg lettuce for crunch, maybe a pickle or two. But the purists kept it simple, just meatloaf and bread, pressed together in one glorious handheld tribute to thrift and taste. It didn't need heat. In fact, reheating it ruined the whole point. Cold meatloaf had a texture all its own, dense, meaty, slightly sweet from the glaze, with a little bit of onion and seasoning tucked inside. You could eat it with one hand while standing at the sink, or wrap it in wax paper and pack it in a lunchbox with a thermos of sweet tea. The best part? It didn't taste like leftovers. It tasted like a reward. Like your family knew how to make something stretch, not just in quantity but in joy. And the memory of it sticks. You might remember Dad in his work shirt, eating one at the counter before heading back to his shift. Or Mom, wrapping one up in foil and slipping it into your backpack. Or Grandpa sitting on the porch, sandwich in one hand, radio play in the background, telling you stories about how he used to eat the same thing back when meatloaf was made with oats and faith. Cold meatloaf sandwiches didn't apologize for being simple. They embraced it. They were dependable, delicious, and downright comforting. They tasted like the kind of wisdom you only get from generations of making do, and making it delicious. So yes, maybe meatloaf night was good, but the day after, that was the real prize. That was the win you didn't have to cook for. That was the magic in the margins. Lazy cabbage roll casserole. All the flavor, none of the fuss. This wasn't Grandma's neatly rolled cabbage leaves tied up like little dinner parcels. No toothpicks. No boiling and peeling soggy leaves. No meticulous stacking in a Dutch oven. Lazy cabbage roll casserole was just that, a lazy, brilliant shortcut passed around in small towns and factory line break rooms, where people had more sense than time. It had all the same warm smells and belly-coating comfort of traditional stuffed cabbage, just with none of the fuss. You browned your ground beef, maybe mix it with a bit of pork if you had some. Toss in diced onions, a generous shake of garlic powder, and a few grains of uncooked rice to soak up all that flavor. The secret? letting it simmer just long enough to start smelling like a Sunday kitchen, even if it was only Wednesday night. Then came the cabbage, coarsely chopped, not fussed over. It didn't need to be delicate. Just hearty green leaves, piled high like firewood. Over that, you poured a can or two of tomato sauce. Cheap, acidic, comforting. If you had diced tomatoes, even better. Some folks added a pinch of brown sugar or a splash of vinegar to mimic that old country tang. Others just let the oven do the work. You'd layer it all into a battered baking dish, cover with foil, and let the magic happen. The oven did what the stovetop couldn't, melding everything into a steamy, bubbling heap of soft cabbage, tender meat, and saucy rice. It didn't cut into clean squares. It spooned out like a mess, and that was a charm. As it baked, the tomato sauce soaked into the rice, the beef melted into the cabbage, and the whole dish turned into a bubbling, steamy, fork-tender mess of comfort. When it came out of the oven, it didn't look fancy, but it smelled like Sunday dinner in a house with 5 kids and no leftovers. Some added a dash of vinegar or a spoonful of sour cream to give it a kick. However you did it, it worked way better than you'd expect. It filled bellies. It reheated well. It traveled well. And more than once, it fed a neighbor who didn't have much that week. Lazy cabbage roll casserole wasn't about showing off. It was about showing up with what you had, with what you could stretch. And for every bite that tasted like an old world dish with new world shortcuts, there was a sense of pride, not in making it perfect, but in making it work. It was a weeknight saver, a freezer hero, a back pocket meal passed down from aunts and cousins, scribbled on stained recipe cards and whispered over fence posts. It was for the busy, the tired, the broke, and the hungry, and it never disappointed. Smothered pork chops, a crispy, saucy upgrade. When you wanted dinner to feel like a treat, but still keep the lights on, smothered pork chops were the go-to. Thick bone-in chops, not too expensive but full of flavor. Got a quick sear in a hot pan until the outside turned golden and crispy. The crust wasn't just for show. It trapped juices inside, keeping the meat tender beneath. But the real secret was the gravy. Once the chops were browned, a little flour was sprinkled into the pan, stirring up every sticky bit left behind. Then came the broth or water, simmering down into a silky sauce. Some added a splash of cream or a pinch of spices if they had them, turning the gravy into something rich and comforting. The chops went back into the pan, swimming in the sauce, covered and left to simmer until fork tender. That sauce was everything. It soaked into every bite, filling gaps, adding depth. You needed bread for this one, a soft, plain white loaf that could soak up the gravy like a sponge. On the side, mashed potatoes, either from scratch or the quick instant kind, creamy and buttery, a perfect counterpoint to the pork. Frozen peas or a quick salad rounded out the plate, but it was always about that chop and gravy. This was comfort food on a budget, a way to turn something ordinary into a meal you looked forward to. No one expected steak. No one needed it. Just warm meat, thick gravy, and a little bit of magic. And leftovers? They made sandwiches that were better than the first go, dipped again in gravy and savored all over. Pork neck bones with gravy, the savory backbone of the working kitchen. Pork neck bones aren't glamorous. They're bony, fatty, and overlooked by most. But in kitchens where every penny mattered, they were gold. Cheap and plentiful, these bones brought more than just meat. They brought flavor. You started by browning them in hot oil, the sizzle loud and steady, filling the kitchen with a smell that told you dinner was coming. The fat crisped up, the edges browned, and every crackle meant flavor locked in. Next came onions, chopped rough and tossed into pan, sizzling in the rendered fat, soaking up every last bit of brown goodness stuck to the bottom. A splash of water or broth deglazed the pan, lifting the caramelized bits into the base of the gravy. Then came the slow simmer. Covered and low, the neck bones cooked down, the meat softening and pulling away from the bones. Hours passed, but the payoff was worth it. The liquid thickened into a rich, silky gravy, full of deep pork flavor. Some cooks stirred in a little flour or cornstarch to give it body. Others let the sauce reduce naturally, thick and glossy. The gravy was the real prize. Poured over a steaming bowl of white rice, it soaked into every grain, coating it in smoky, meaty goodness. Add a biscuit or a few slices of white bread, and dinner was complete. There was no rush here. This was comfort that waited for patience. And if the meat was sparse, you stretched the meal further with rice, vegetables, or even a spoonful of beans. Pork neck bones weren't just food. They were a symbol of making do, of turning the humble into something hearty, of a kitchen that never wasted a scrap. Factory town boiled dinner. Corned beef and cabbage, slow and steady. This dish didn't start in restaurants. It started in small kitchens next to steel mills, paper plants, and rail yards, where the air smelled like work, and the pots boiled long before the sun came up. The factory town boiled dinner, corned beef, cabbage, and whatever root vegetables you had lying around, wasn't a luxury. It was survival that tasted like tradition. You didn't need much. A tough slab of corned beef, pink and salty, usually marked down after holidays. A head of cabbage, a few carrots, a couple potatoes, maybe a turnip if you were lucky. All of it went into one big pot, simmering low and slow. The aroma of peppercorns, bay leaves, and meat-salted steam would drift through the house, clinging to the curtains and coats by the door. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. You didn't slice the vegetables pretty, just rough chunks, big enough to fill a spoon, small enough to stretch. The cabbage softened into silky ribbons, soaking up every ounce of that meaty broth. The potatoes, they fell apart just right, and the carrots gave the dish just enough sweetness to balance the salt. There was a rhythm to it. You started the meat in the morning. You let the kitchen get humid with that slow simmering comfort. Maybe you turned it down and left for a shift, trusting the stove to do what it always did. Or maybe it was a Sunday dish, filling the house while laundry hung on the line, and the kids argued over chores. When it was ready, you didn't plate it pretty. You ladled it into bowls, meat, veg, and that cloudy broth that tasted like something older than you. Some folks added mustard. Some swore by a slab of butter melting over the cabbage. And if you were really stretching it, you made a bit of gravy from broth, spooned over day-old bread. Leftovers tasted even better the next day, reheated in a skillet with an egg cracked in, or mashed together like a hash. Nothing went to waste. The pot liquor alone was a prize. What made it special wasn't the ingredients. It was the patience, the quiet respect for slow food, for letting tough cuts tenderize into something beautiful, for turning scraps and ends into something worthy of gathering around. In factory towns, this was a common meal, but it never felt common. It was a hot meal in cold weather, a meal that filled a room and a stomach, the kind of thing you could carry in a thermos or wrap in foil for lunch break. It was a meal that didn't apologize for being plain. It wore its thrift like armor, and it fed generations. That boiled dinner, humble, steaming, deeply satisfying, wasn't just food. It was care, simmered for hours, served without pretense. And somehow, it always brought people to the table. Salisbury steak with mushroom gravy. Diner classics at home. Salisbury steak was the closest many families got to steakhouse food without breaking the bank. Ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, salt, and pepper became patties, shaped by hand, flattened just enough to sear quickly and evenly. Some added a splash of Worcestershire if they could splurge. The patties hit a hot skillet, sizzling as the edges browned and crisped. Once cooked on both sides, they were set aside, but the real magic was yet to come. Mushrooms, sliced thin, hit the pan, softening in the leftover fat. Onions joined them, translucent and sweet. A sprinkle of flour dusted the pan, soaking up the drippings. Then broth or water poured in, stirred until bubbling and thickening into a rich, savory gravy. The patties slid back in, simmering gently, soaking up every bit of that flavor. The result was juicy meat cloaked in silky, mushroom-laden sauce. On the side, mashed potatoes, boxed or homemade, provided creamy comfort. Frozen peas, buttered or plain, rounded out the plate. No one expected a restaurant meal. This was diner food made at home, warm, filling, and a little indulgent on a weeknight. Leftovers often became sandwiches, with gravy spread like mayo between slices of bread. It wasn't fancy. It was just exactly what you needed. Oatmeal meatloaf, stretching every bite with simple ingenuity. Oatmeal Meatloaf is a perfect example of working-class creativity, turning a modest pound of ground beef into a meal that could feed a family with just a few pantry staples and a little know-how. When breadcrumbs were scarce or too expensive, Oats stepped in as the unsung hero, not only holding the loaf together, but adding a hearty texture and a subtle nutty flavor that made every bite count. The process was straightforward but effective. Ground beef was mixed with rolled oats, dry and ready to soak up the moisture from eggs and milk added to the mix. The oats weren't just fillers. They gave the meatloaf a satisfying chewiness and helped stretch a small amount of meat into something bigger, without losing any flavor or heartiness. Seasoning was simple but essential. A pinch of salt and black pepper were the basics, but if you had a chopped onion or a splash of Worcestershire sauce, that was luxury. The ingredients came together in a bowl, mixed until combined, then pressed into a pan or loaf dish, ready for the oven. The topping was often the star of the show, a generous layer of ketchup spread across the top before baking. As the meatloaf cooked, the ketchup caramelized into a sweet, tangy glaze that added a burst of flavor and a beautiful sheen. Some families added a dash of brown sugar to the topping for extra sweetness, turning the simple meatloaf into a comfort food classic. Baking slowly until the edges pulled away and the top bubbled and caramelized, the oatmeal meatloaf emerged warm and inviting, filling the kitchen with a rich, savory aroma that made everyone's mouth water. The oats inside gave the loaf a texture that was both tender and firm, holding everything together without becoming mushy. Served thickly sliced alongside can green beans or creamy mashed potatoes. This meatloaf was more than just a meal. It was a reminder that with a bit of ingenuity and resourcefulness, even the humblest ingredients could come together to create something satisfying and memorable. Oatmeal meatloaf also had the benefit of leftovers. Cold slices were perfect for sandwiches, layered with mustard or mayo and nestled between soft bread. Another way to stretch a meal and keep hunger at bay. It was a dish that made do, that adapted, and that proved time and again that flavor and fullness didn't need to come with a high price tag. In kitchens where every penny counted, oatmeal meatloaf was a quiet triumph, a blend of thrift taste and tradition that still resonates with anyone who's ever needed to make a little go a long way. Creamed tuna on egg noodles, pantry magic on a plate. There's something about the humble marriage of creamed tuna and egg noodles that whispers of a time when meals were made with love, not labels. This dish didn't come from a glossy cookbook or a fancy chef's kitchen. It came from a pantry, from that quiet shelf where a can of tuna sat beside a box of noodles and a forgotten tin of peas, waiting for someone with just enough imagination to pull it all together. At its heart, creamed tuna on egg noodles was a dish born of necessity. When meat was too expensive or rationed or simply not there, tuna came to the rescue. Not the sushi-grade kind, but the oil-packed or water-packed kind that came in a squat metal can with a pop-top or key-turn lid. It wasn't glamorous, but it was there, and it was good enough. The process started with a roux, flour and butter bubbling gently in a pan until it turned golden and nutty. Then came the milk, poured in slow, whisked until smooth. This was a cream in creamed tuna, a simple bechamel that transformed a few ingredients into something rich and velvety. The tuna, flaked gently with a fork, was folded into the sauce, along with peas if you had them, or chopped boiled eggs if you didn't. Some added a pinch of garlic powder or a shake of paprika. Others stirred in a bit of grated cheese if they could spare it. Meanwhile, the egg noodles boiled on the back burner, their wide, curling ribbons softening into chewy strands that could hold onto every drop of creamy sauce. When it all came together, sauce over noodles, maybe with some breadcrumbs or crumbled crackers on top, it wasn't flashy, but it was filling, it was warm, and most importantly, it felt like someone cared. Creamed tuna on egg noodles was the kind of meal you could put on the table in 20 minutes, even when your fridge was nearly empty. It showed up on dinner plates in working-class homes across the country, steel towns, farmhouses, row homes with cracked linoleum floors and Formica counters. It was the kind of dinner a tired mom could make after a long day, with kids sitting at the kitchen table doing homework and a dog curled up near the stove. It didn't pretend to be more than it was. That was its charm. It was pantry magic, a way to turn nothing into something. It didn't need fancy herbs or imported oils. It just needed a little care, a little heat, and the quiet determination of someone trying to feed their family with what they had. Even today, long after tuna noodle casseroles have fallen out of fashion, there's a comfort in making it again. The aroma of butter and milk, the steam rising from the noodles, the way the sauce clings to every bite. It takes you back to simpler times, to family dinners, to being full, even when money was tight. Creamed tuna on egg noodles isn't just a meal. It's a memory. Skillet ground beef casserole with saltine crust. Quick comfort from pantry staples. This wasn't the kind of casserole that came from a box. It didn't need instructions, branding, or a microwave. It came from instinct. From growing up watching someone stir ground beef in a cast iron skillet, crushing crackers with their hands, and layering flavor like it was second nature. The skillet ground beef casserole with saltine crust was one of those working-class weeknight saviors. No measuring cups, no timers, just a good hot pan, some ground meat, and whatever you could pull from the pantry. It didn't matter if it looked pretty. What mattered was that it filled bellies, stretched a dollar, and felt good going down. It started with a pound of ground beef, sometimes less, browned with onions, maybe bell peppers if you had them. The fat hissed and sputtered in the pan, turning the air rich and savory. A spoonful of tomato paste or a squirt of ketchup gave it depth. A dash of Worcestershire or some bouillon cubes dissolved into the mix gave it a kind of homemade umami that made it taste like more than the sum of its parts. Once the meat was browned and seasoned, it went to fillers. Cooked rice, canned corn, peas, leftover beans, diced carrots. Whatever was in the fridge or cupboard. This wasn't just a recipe. It was a strategy, a way to make something out of next to nothing. Then came the crust. Not a pie crust, not breadcrumbs. Saltines, crushed in a plastic bag or under a rolling pin. Sometimes seasoned, sometimes plain. Sprinkled thick across the top of the bubbling beef mixture and pressed down just enough to form a kind of golden lid. A drizzle of melted butter or a splash of milk helped it crisp in the oven or under the broiler, turning pale crackers into a crunchy, toasty crown. When it came out, steaming and aromatic, it wasn't fancy, but it was right. The saltine crust added that bit of crunch and salt that played perfectly against the soft, savory filling. It was a kind of dinner you ate out of a wide, shallow bowl, with a big spoon and maybe a splash of hot sauce. It was a kind of meal that had you going back for seconds, and if you were lucky, thirds. This casserole didn't come with rules. No strict list of ingredients. No right or wrong way to build it. It was adaptable, forgiving, made to serve 6 when you only had enough for 4. It carried the fingerprint of grandmothers and aunts and tired dads standing over stoves after work, thinking, what can I make with this? It was a patchwork of pantry staples, stitched together with seasoning and heart, and somehow it always worked. Even now, years later, pulling together ground beef, a few veggies, and some old crackers can bring back the smell of home, the creak of the oven door, the scrape of forks on chipped ceramic plates, the warm hush that settles over a table when everyone's eating, and for just a moment, everything feels full. Instant mashed potatoes with cutlets, the quick fix that feels like a treat. When days were long, budgets tight, and time in the kitchen even tighter, instant mashed potatoes paired with breaded cutlets became a simple, beloved staple for many working families. It was a kind of meal that didn't demand hours of prep or a pantry full of fancy ingredients, but still felt like a small celebration at the end of the day. The cutlets themselves were usually thin slices of cheap veal, pork, or chicken, cuts that didn't need to be thick or juicy to satisfy. Their magic came from the breading and the quick pan fry that turned them golden and crispy. First, the meat was dusted lightly in flour, just enough to help the egg wash stick. Then came the dip in beaten eggs, which acted like glue for the breadcrumbs. Finally, a good coating of dry, seasoned breadcrumbs sealed the deal. When the cutlets hit the hot skillet with a bit of oil or butter, they sizzled immediately. The sound was hypnotic. The crackle of crust forming, the gentle pop of fat heating, and the aroma that quickly filled the kitchen, promising something good was on the way. The crust turned golden brown fast, while the inside stayed tender and soft. It wasn't a thick, juicy steak, but it had crunch, flavor, and a little bit of class on an everyday plate. Meanwhile, instant mashed potatoes came to the rescue in the blink of an eye. Made from a simple powder mixed with hot water or milk, they whipped up into a creamy, fluffy side that could be ready in minutes. For some, a knob of butter melting into the mound of potatoes was the perfect finishing touch, turning simple starch into silky comfort. Sometimes there was gravy, poured generously over cutlets and potatoes, soaking into every bite. Other times, a sprinkle of salt and pepper was enough. This meal was far from fancy, but that's exactly why it worked. For families juggling work schedules, bills, and hungry kids, it was a dinner they could count on, quick, satisfying, and warm. It gave the feeling of a home-cooked meal without the fuss, and that little crunch of the cutlets alongside the smooth, buttery potatoes was enough to make anyone feel cared for. Even on the busiest nights, this pairing felt like a moment of normalcy, a quiet reminder that despite the daily grind, dinner could still be a comforting ritual. It was a kind of meal passed down by moms and grandmas who knew the value of stretching a dollar without sacrificing flavor. Instant mashed potatoes with breaded cutlets weren't just a quick fix. They were a small celebration of making something good, simple, and honest every single time. Fried bologna and eggs with grits, Southern comfort on a skillet. Few breakfasts carry the soul of Southern working-class kitchens, quite like fried bologna and eggs served alongside a steaming bowl of grits. It's a meal built on simplicity, thrift, and pure comfort, a dish that fills the stomach and warms the spirit, readying folks for a long day of hard work. Bologna, often dismissed as cheap lunch meat, transforms completely when it hits a hot skillet. The thin slices sizzle immediately, their edges curling up as the fat renders down, crisping to golden perfection. That salty, smoky aroma wafts through the kitchen and pulls everyone toward the table. It's the smell of familiarity, of childhood mornings and late nights after shifts, a scent that tells you good things are coming. Eggs cook right in the same pan, absorbing the leftover flavor and fat from the bologna. Whether scrambled or fried, their edges get a little lacy and brown, adding texture and richness to every bite. The eggs bring softness and protein, balancing out the crispiness of the bologna with a mild, comforting taste. Then there are the grits, simple ground corn that's been a staple of Southern tables for generations. Cooked slowly until creamy and smooth, grits soak up butter and salt like a sponge, becoming the perfect, warm base of the salty bologna and rich eggs. Some add a splash of milk or a pat of butter to get the perfect silky texture. Others might stir in cheese or a pinch of pepper for a little extra flavor punch. Together, fried bologna, eggs, and grits make a breakfast that's more than the sum of its parts. It's about sustenance, fuel, and family tradition. It's about making the most of what's on hand, turning humble ingredients into a plateful of comfort. Kids love the sweet-salty combo, often piling the bologna atop grits or scooping eggs to mix with every bite. For adults, this meal is both nostalgia and necessity. Something quick to whip up before heading to work, but satisfying enough to last until lunch. This is breakfast that doesn't require fancy equipment or expensive ingredients, just a skillet, a stove, and a little know-how. It's a meal rooted in resourcefulness and tradition, and for many, it's a daily reminder that good food doesn't have to be complicated to be meaningful. Fried bologna and eggs with grits isn't just Southern comfort. It's a story of resilience and heart served right on a plate. Tuna patties with saltines and mustard, crunch and zing in every bite. Tuna patties have long been a humble hero in kitchens where making the most of every ingredient wasn't just a skill. It was a necessity. Simple to make and surprisingly satisfying, these patties turn a can of tuna into something crispy, flavorful, and hearty enough to feed a family on a budget. The magic starts with canned tuna, drained and flaked into flaky, salty pieces that carry the ocean's briny taste with every bite. It was affordable, shelf-stable, and packed with protein, everything a working family needed when fresh meat was scarce or costly. But tuna alone isn't enough to hold a patty together or give it texture, so crushed saltines come into play. These salty crackers add a subtle crunch and soak up moisture, binding the tuna and seasonings into a workable mix. The saltines also help stretch the tuna farther, making sure each patty fills out just right. Egg acts as a glue, holding the mixture tight while giving the patties a tender bite. Then comes a dash of mustard, not just for flavor, but for a little zing that cuts through the richness and lifts the whole dish. Some families added chopped onions or a splash of hot sauce for extra punch, But the basic mix was always a winner. Once formed into patties, not too thick, not too thin, they hit a hot skillet with oil or butter. The sound of sizzling patties hitting the pan was a signal that dinner was on its way. As the outside crisped to a golden brown, the smell filled the kitchen, a warm, savory aroma that brought everyone to the table. The contrast between the crispy crust and the soft, flavorful inside was part of the charm. Every bite offered a little crunch, a little tang, and a whole lot of comfort. The patties were quick to cook, making them a perfect option for weeknight dinners or last-minute meals. Serve with squeeze of mustard, a dollop of ketchup, or even plain on a plate. Tuna patties didn't just fill bellies. They reminded families that good food could come from the simplest ingredients. They were proof that thrift and creativity could turn a humble can of tuna into a meal that felt homemade, hearty, and satisfying. For kids, these patties were a crispy, fun alternative to plain tuna sandwiches. For adults, they were a reliable, budget-friendly classic that stretched grocery dollars without sacrificing flavor or warmth. Tuna patties with saltines and mustard weren't just a dish. They were a memory, a comfort, and a testament to cooking with heart and thrift. Navy bean soup with ham bone, a bowl of deep flavor and frugality. Navy bean soup with ham bone is a kind of meal that tells a story with every spoonful, a story of thrift, patience, and soulful flavor born from humble ingredients. This soup was a cornerstone of working-class kitchens, especially in places where meat was scarce, but a ham bone was a treasured prize. The magic started with the ham bone itself, left over from a Sunday dinner or a holiday feast. It was never wasted. Instead, it went straight into a big pot of water, simmering low and slow for hours. That bone, with its bits of meat and marrow tucked deep inside, infused the broth with a smoky richness that no broth cube could match. Into that simmering pot went navy beans, small, hearty legumes that soaked up every drop of flavor while cooking down to a creamy, hearty texture. These beans were cheap, filling, and packed with protein and fiber, a perfect foundation for a meal that could stretch to feed a family without breaking the bank. Onions, garlic, and sometimes a carrot or two joined the party, adding subtle sweetness and depth to the broth. Some cooks toss in bay leaves or a splash of vinegar to brighten the flavors. The soup would bubble gently for hours, transforming simple ingredients into a thick, savory bowl of comfort. As the beans softened and the broth turned rich and velvety, pieces of tender ham were pulled off the bone and stirred back in. The resulting soup was a perfect balance of smoky meat, creamy beans, and aromatic vegetables, a one-pot meal that filled stomachs and warmed hearts. Navy bean soup wasn't just dinner. It was a lesson in resourcefulness. It taught families to use every scrap, to savor slow-cooked flavor, and to turn the least expensive ingredients into something extraordinary. Leftovers thickened overnight and tasted even better the next day, making it a true working-class champion. Served with a crusty piece of bread or a simple biscuit, navy bean soup with ham bone was a meal that carried history, hard work, and a whole lot of love. Fried chicken gizzard with hot sauce, crispy, spicy, and unapologetically bold. Chicken gizzard are often overlooked, but in many working-class homes, they were a prized delicacy, a crunchy, flavorful treat that could turn a cheap cut into a mouth-watering meal. Fried chicken gizzards with hot sauce are all about texture, boldness, and a little bit of attitude on the plate. First, the gizzards needed a good cleaning and a soak, sometimes overnight, to tenderize the tough muscle and mellow out their strong flavor. Then came the dredging in seasoned flour or cornmeal, sometimes a mix of both. Coated in spices that range from simple salt and pepper to paprika, garlic powder, and cayenne. Once properly coated, the gizzards hit a hot skillet or deep fryer, where they sizzled and popped, turning golden brown and irresistibly crispy. The sound alone was enough to make mouths water. The snap of crust breaking, the aroma of fried spices filling the kitchen. Fried chicken gizzards were bite-sized pockets of crunch and savory flavor, each one chewy but tender on the inside. The seasoning packed a punch, but the real magic came when they met the hot sauce. A good splash of hot sauce, tangy, spicy, and slightly vinegary, cut through the richness of the fried coating, waking up the taste buds and bringing a fiery kick that balanced every bite. It was a simple combination, but one that demanded attention. This dish was often eaten as a snack or a main meal, served alongside a cold beer or a glass of sweet tea. It was a kind of food that brought families and friends together, comforting, bold, and unapologetically down to earth. Fried chicken gizzards with hot sauce spoke to a culinary tradition of using every part of the bird, turning humble ingredients into something extraordinary through seasoning, frying, and a little bit of love. Potato pancakes from leftover mash, crispy, golden, and comfort on a plate. Leftover mashed potatoes rarely went to waste in working-class kitchens. Instead, they found new life in potato pancakes, a crispy, golden solution to stretch every bite and turn yesterday's dinner into today's treat. The process started by mixing leftover mashed potatoes with simple binders, an egg or two to hold things together, a spoonful of flour or breadcrumbs to add structure, and a pinch of salt and pepper for flavor. Some families added finely chopped onions or herbs like parsley brighten the taste, but the base was always humble. The batter was spooned by hand into a hot skillet where it hit sizzling oil, forming little golden discs that crisped on outside while staying soft and creamy inside. The smell was pure comfort. Warm potatoes fried with a hint of butter and onion. Flipping them carefully, cooks aim for even browning on both sides, the edges curling up just right. These pancakes were quick to make and perfect for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Potato pancakes carried the warmth of home and the spirit of resourcefulness, turning what might have been discarded into a starving meal. Served plain or with a dollop of sour cream or applesauce on the side, they were simple but satisfying. For families watching their budgets, potato pancakes were more than just leftovers. They were proof that with little creativity and patience, food could be delicious, filling, and never wasted. Every crispy bite carried the echoes of kitchen conversations, laughter, and the kind of daily rituals that make a house a home. Spam fried rice, pantry staple turned savory sensation. Spam fried rice is a dish born from necessity and shaped by creativity. A perfect example of how a few simple ingredients can come together to make a satisfying meal. For working-class families who needed quick, hearty dinners without fuss, Spam was a godsend. Shelf-stable, affordable, and packed with flavor, it became a kitchen hero. The process began with a can of Spam, sliced or diced into small cubes. The salty, slightly smoky meat hit a hot skillet and started to sizzle, browning around the edges and releasing a mouth-watering aroma. That savory smell was a beacon, signaling that dinner was on its way. Leftover rice, ideally cold and a little dried out, was the perfect companion. Tossed into the pan with the Spam, it soaked up every bit of rendered fat and flavor. Onions, garlic, and sometimes frozen peas or carrots were added to bring sweetness, color, and texture. A splash of soy sauce or a dash of seasoning gave the dish its signature umami punch, turning plain ingredients into something rich and comforting. Stir-fried quickly over high heat, the rice became slightly crisp in spots, each bite a mix of tender grains and crunchy edges. Spam fried rice was more than just a meal. It was a solution to stretch leftovers and pantry staples into a filling dish that fed the family without breaking the bank. It was quick, easy, and flexible, perfect for weeknights or whenever time was short but hunger was high. This dish carries a spirit of resourcefulness and simplicity, proving that good food doesn't need to be complicated. A few humble ingredients, a hot pan, and a little know-how could create a savory sensation that felt like home. Butter noodles with black pepper. Simple, savory, and soul-soothing. Butter noodles with black pepper might sound modest, but for many working-class kitchens, this was comfort in its purest form. With just a handful of pantry staples, it turned plain noodles into a warm, satisfying dish that could stand on its own or accompany heartier meals. The base was wide egg noodles or whatever pasta was on hand, boiled until tender but still firm, soft enough to melt in your mouth, yet sturdy enough to hold up under a generous coating of butter. The butter melted slowly over the drained noodles, pooling in golden ribbons that coated every strand. Then came the black pepper, cracked fresh or sprinkled generously from the shaker, adding a spicy warmth that contrasted perfectly with the rich, creamy butter. No fancy sauces here, just the straightforward comfort of buttery noodles kissed by pepper's gentle heat. Some families added a pinch of salt or a little grated cheese if available, but mostly it was about the simple pleasure of texture and warmth. This dish was fast to prepare, requiring minimal ingredients and no complicated steps, making it go-to when time or resources were tight. It was also endlessly adaptable. Served as a main dish or a side, with a fried egg on top or alongside roasted vegetables. Buttered noodles with black pepper carry a nostalgic weight, reminding people of kitchen tables where simplicity meant love, and a humble bowl of pasta was enough to soothe a hungry soul. Poor man's pie, sweet, rustic, and made from scratch. Poor man's pie is the kind of dessert that speaks volumes without saying much. It's a humble, rustic creation born out of necessity and ingenuity. A simple pie made from the bare essentials: sugar, flour, butter, and whatever little extras were on hand. This wasn't a showpiece dessert for fancy occasions. It was a slice of sweet comfort baked with care in kitchens where resources were limited but hearts were full. The crust of poor man's pie was straightforward but crucial. Made from just flour and butter, sometimes a splash of water or milk to bring it together, it required little more than elbow grease and patience. Rolled out on a floured surface, the dough might not have been perfectly uniform or elegant, but held its own, flaky and tender once baked. For many, the act of pressing that dough into a pan was a quiet ritual, a moment of calm amidst the daily grind. The filling, depending on what was available, could vary from region to region, household to household. Sometimes it was a simple sugar-based custard, subtly sweet and creamy, baked until set and golden. Other times, it included whatever fruit was on hand: stewed apples, canned berries, or even dried fruits rehydrated with a touch of water or syrup. Spices like cinnamon or nutmeg might have found their way into the mix if someone had them, adding a warm, fragrant note that lingered in the kitchen air. Once assembled, the pie baked low and slow, filling the house with a homey aroma that promised warmth and satisfaction. The crust turned a beautiful golden brown, slightly crisp at the edges but soft where it met the sweet filling. When sliced, each piece was a perfect balance of buttery crust and comforting sweetness, simple but deeply satisfying. Poor man's pie was more than just dessert. It was a symbol of making do, of finding sweetness in hard times, and creating something delicious with what little was available. It was a reminder that you didn't need expensive ingredients or fancy recipes to bring joy to the table. Sometimes, all you needed was a little flour, a pat of butter, and a touch of love. For families facing tight budgets and long days, this pie was a quiet victory, a treat that required effort but gave back even more in return. It was the kind of dish that carried the flavor of resilience, the sweetness of hope, and the warmth of home all at once. Even today, poor man's pie stands as a testament to creativity and heart of working-class kitchens everywhere. Cornbread and milk, in a bowl, the ultimate comfort in simplicity. Cornbread and milk in a bowl might seem like the simplest dish imaginable, but for generations of working-class families, it was much more than just a snack or a light meal. It was a comforting ritual, a reminder of home, and a humble luxury during hard times. This dish began with cornbread, that golden, crumbly staple born from cornmeal, water, a little flour, and sometimes a pinch of sugar or fat if available. Cornbread was affordable and easy to make, often baked in a cast-iron skillet or simple pan. Its texture was unique, crumbly yet moist, with just enough sweetness and a hint of earthiness from the cornmeal. Leftover cornbread, whether from a busy dinner or a batch made in advance, found its way into a bowl, broken into bite-sized pieces that were then drenched with cold or warm milk. The milk softened the cornbread, turning it into a creamy, pudding-like mixture that was both filling and soothing. For some, this was a late-night snack, a breakfast substitute, or a light meal when nothing else was left. For others, it was a nostalgic comfort food, evoking memories of kitchen tables where simple pleasures were savored and shared. The combination of cornbread and milk brought a balance of flavors and textures. The sweet graininess of the cornbread mingled with the smooth, cool richness of milk. Some families stirred in a little sugar, a sprinkle of cinnamon, or even a dash of salt to enhance the taste. Others preferred it plain, appreciating the honest simplicity. What made cornbread and milk so special was not just the flavor, but the meaning behind it. It was a dish born from necessity, from a time when every crumb mattered and meals were stretched to their limits. It was a reminder of resilience and creativity, turning humble ingredients into something warm and satisfying. Eating cornbread and milk was a quiet act of comfort. It didn't require fancy utensils or preparation, just a bowl, a spoon, and a moment to slow down. In the swirl of milk-soaked crumbs, there's a sense of homecoming, of simpler times, and of enduring spirit. In many ways, this dish stands as a symbol of working-class kitchens everywhere, a testament to making do, to finding joy in what you have, and to the small, everyday moments that make life sweet. These working-class dinners may not be glamorous, but they carry a richness that goes beyond taste. They tell stories of grit, resourcefulness, and care passed down through generations. Each dish is a reminder that food isn't just fuel. It's history, culture, and survival all wrapped into one plate. In a world where convenience often overshadows tradition, these meals stand as quiet heroes, humble, hearty, and honest. So next time you sit down to eat, remember the hands and hearts that shape these recipes, and maybe, just maybe, give one of these forgotten classics a try. Because sometimes the most unassuming meals are the ones that fill us up the most.